Good evening, everybody. Hey, Laura, can you hear me? Lila, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thumbs up. Okay. Good evening, all. Welcome back to EDL740, Introduction to Graduate Research. Some of you came back anyway. We lost 2 or 3 during the week, and I just hate that. I hope it wasn't because I had a bad hair day last week. Say, normally I'm Zooming myself to you from my ranch out in West Texas. But tonight, I'm Zooming myself to you from a parking lot in a courthouse, in a county courthouse parking lot out in West Texas. I was able to come watch a couple of my granddaughters run a cross-country meet this evening, and so the backdrop behind me is my RV. So hopefully the county sheriff doesn't get suspicious about this RV parked in the courthouse parking lot, and we'll be able to complete class. The chat box is open. I'll address questions at some point later in the evening. If you'll post those, that'll be great, and I'll make sure that I come back to them. As normal, I'll make a few comments at the beginning here of the session, some reminders, little housekeeping reminders, and then also some comments that I have about the coursework, the course content. This will not be a lecture at all. Mainly, I want to give you all opportunity to ask me questions or bounce ideas off of me. We've started the proposal pitch process now, and hopefully your brain is beginning to think in terms of what kind of study would I like to conduct and what questions could I ask. But first, a reminder to you that your assignments are due at 11:30 p.m. on Sunday nights, except in week 7, in which they're due on Saturday night of that week, because I have a grade posting deadlines staring at me on the following Monday. Let's talk about the APA citation things in week 1. Quite a few of you, I poked you to tell you that your citations were not quite correct. I gave you guidance in the Moodle module up in the general section at the beginning of the course to help you with that. But fundamentally, just remember the 4 pieces you need in a citation that'll pass muster with me. Now, Cricket's working on her doctorate, so that's a completely different monster. I mean, she has to fight the APA citation gods. But for my purposes, I want you to just get the 4 critical ingredients, which is the name of the persons, or person or persons, the authors of the content. Don't use an organization that's publishing the content unless you absolutely cannot find the name of the authors. But number 1, the name of the author or authors that created that content. Number 2, the year that content was created. Most of the times it'll be obvious and visible, but sometimes you have to dig around and look for it. Number 3, the title of the content. And number 4, where that content was either published in hard copy or where the URL, the website address that you picked it up, where you retrieved it. Those are the 4 key ingredients. So if you give me an APA citation that's lacking one of those 4, then you're probably going to get a little message from me in the Moodle gradebook. It says, citation is not quite right. Please get it fixed. At the beginning, I'll give you the chance to get it fixed and revise your grade back upward. As we move along in the course, though, I'll expect that you graduate students will figure this out and know how to do it. Let's talk about grading for a second, because some of you got notification, several of you got notification from me in the grade book when I posted your grade for learning task 1 and 2. I'm not done with 3 and 4 yet, but 5 is in the books. Learning task 5 is in the books. But some of you got little comments, feedback from me that maybe I didn't see the evidence of critical thinking that I was looking for. There was not the richness of the context or the rationale to support your thinking. Several of you tried, and I told you about this last week, but several of you tried to dodge that least beneficial prompt that's in your Google form I'm not going to let you get away with saying it's all good. No, nothing there that is not beneficial to me. I didn't ask you if it was beneficial or not beneficial. I asked you to tell me what was the least beneficial, because I'm trying to get your brain to think on both ends of that continuum. What am I reading here that's going to be extremely useful for me? And then what am I reading here that's probably I'm least likely to use? Let me give you an analogy to help you, those of you that may have struggled a little bit, particularly on the top takeaways. It would not be sufficient for you to say to me as one of your top takeaways is, from this article, I found out the difference between a Chevy and a Ford. That's not quite enough. If the article told you about the differences in Chevys and Fords, then tell me a little bit what you learned about the differences between Chevy and Fords. Think of it like this. When you're writing those top 3 takeaways, just assume that you're talking to a person that's a neophyte, someone that doesn't understand, that has not read the content or listened to the content, or someone that needs for you to explain a little bit of why you picked what you picked. I hope that'll help. I'm going to keep poking you if I don't think it's sufficient. And for the first week or 2, I'm going to let you try to revise it. My goal, I would love, I can promise you, on October the 21st, I think is the day I have to submit grades. I would absolutely love to just put an A by every one of your name. But you're going to have to earn it. I'm not going to give it to you. That brings me to mind too. I told you last week that I'm approaching the course completely from the perspective, whether you're Med-C or Metal, or in Cricket's case, doctoral. I'm approaching the content that I'm choosing for you, and I want you to look through this and think through this from the perspective of school leadership. Because all of you, I'm just working under the assumption that all of you are going to be taking on either formally a leadership role in your school, or as often as not, it'll be an informal role. Some of you are already playing the informal role of leadership, which is just as important as the formal roles. But in the rubric, in our grading rubric, you'll notice that I put in there that the expectation is that you're using usual and customary professional writing conventions. Please don't give me texting conventions or the shorthand versions of stuff. Pretend you're writing, when you're writing, pretend you're the school leader and you're writing to your faculty or your staff. And here's why. You and I need to avoid things that cause distractions. If we're doing our job well as school leaders, then we have some very clear messages that we're sending, and we're sending them repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, and we're reinforcing them with as much evidence and content as we can come about. But when we do things that distract folks from those messages, then it dilutes our messages. So I know you know how to text. I know, and an emoticon every once in a while is okay, but don't fill up a page with acronyms and shortcuts and no capital letters and no punctuation. Usual and customary professional writing. That's what we need. I've already talked to you about the least beneficial prompt. If you dodge it, you're going to hear from me about it. A couple or 3 of you have already commented about some of the redundancy of the content, and that's going to happen. It's actually going to happen in any course you take, and it probably happened in every course you've ever taken. But especially when the content is coming at you, like instead of me choosing one textbook and trying to march us through one textbook, I'm feeding you content from a wide variety of thinkers and writers and presenters. And so there will be a little bit of redundancy in the content, which is fine. I get that. Particularly, you're going to hear the difference in qualitative and quantitative a lot. And that's okay. You may even be hearing it right up to week 7. Okay. Some of you, that's brand new learning. Some of you obviously had gotten a taste of that maybe back as far as high school. But few people stick their nose in it, and we'll spend a whole week on quantitative stuff, and we'll spend a whole week on qualitative stuff. And for those of you that choose to pursue a doctorate, and no doubt in my mind, several of you will be Dr. So-and-so at some point in time. But as you go through that journey, you're going to take a bath in qualitative tools, and you're going to take a bath in quantitative tools. In this course, it's just introductory stuff, and we're just going to skim over the top of it. A few of you commented on the pain that you felt when you were trying to work your way through the slideshow presentation. You couldn't figure out how to manage the speed of that, because it's not a typical PowerPoint where you back up and go forward. If you'll hit that pause button right in the middle of that little menu bar at the bottom of a slideshow, it'll keep feeding the text for that particular slide till that one slide's filled up, but it will not move to the next slide until you come off of that pause bar. And I think that'll help you, especially those of you that were trying to take notes and it was frustrating to you because you felt like it was moving too fast for you. I told you last week that our goal, Dr. Perry indicated to me when he brought me on board last year and asked me if I would teach this course. He was very interested in teaching the course from the perspective of making very astute consumers of research rather than forcing you to produce a study of some kind. And so I'm with respect to his wishes, and I think that it's very wise intention on his part. My goal is to try to make sure that you become skillful in your consumption of the research, critical in the consumption of that research, and skeptical in the consumption of that research. You and I, as professionals, had better be skillful, critical, and skeptical as we consume research and we absorb ideas and theories that people propose. Look for the evidence. You're always looking for the evidence. That's at the end of the day, that's what we want. Also, at the end of the day, it reminds me of my dissertation chair. One of the things that Dr. Sieg used to say to me was, Nelson, there are many confounding and mediating variables. And the more you dig around in research, regardless of what field it is, I mean, we're talking specifically leadership or education, but you'll find contradictions in the research. And that's natural. It's perfectly natural. For instance, in the field of earth science, physics, theoretical physics, there's a broad number of scientists that absolutely are convinced, based on their examination of the evidence, that we all started with a Big Bang. But there's also a pretty fair number of scientists in those professional fields that are not quite convinced we started with a Big Bang. And they both can cite research to support and theories to support their positions. At the end of the day, you and I have to consume the research carefully and make decisions, and particularly in school leadership, you consume the research. It's much better if you're doing it with a team of smart other people. And then you begin crafting solutions and discerning and sifting through the evidence to make the decisions you think are right for your campus or your school district at that moment in time. I ask you, one of the things in your prompts on your Google form is I ask you about the funding, and I'm sure some of you are wondering why that matters. Well, here's why that matters. You want to know who funded it if the authors of the study reveal who funded the study, because who funded it that's a skeptical question that I pose to you, because every time you read research, you should ask yourself, who's underwriting the cost for this? And I'll give you an example. Many of you work in elementary or middle schools, which I've been a campus principal in both. And so a very common tool, and a good tool that many campuses use, is called Accelerated Reader. But if you would come across a study that was studying the efficacy of Accelerated Reader, that would be a great study. And I can tell you from experience, I've seen Accelerated Reader do a great deal to enhance the likelihood that children become voracious readers for the rest of their lives. But I've also seen Accelerated Reader used in such a way that it drove children absolutely away from wanting to read anything. But if you were to come across a study that was studying the efficacy of Accelerated Reader, which would be a great study. But then at the end of the study, they let you know that the money for that research was put up by Accelerated Reader. That ought to make your BS meter start ringing, okay? Yeah, bells start ringing here, because there's intense pressure on a researcher. If the money is coming from that particular vendor, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the researcher to provide conclusions and results that are favorable to the vendor that's putting up the money for the research. Same thing as we see it, particularly those problems of those kinds, particularly in research on drugs in the pharmaceutical industry, vaccines, same thing. We see the same sort of problems in agriculture. My wife and I make money in the agriculture industry. That's one of our revenue streams. And so the efficacy of beef in the diet, those are quality studies. They can be quality studies, but if the money is being for the study is being provided by the beef industry, well, maybe we should be a little skeptical about the outcomes that are found in, or the conclusions that are found in the study. The research, let's talk about research questions for just a few moments. Oh, wait a minute, before I go back, let me go back to the funding thing. So if the authors reveal to you who's funded the study, every university, LSU Shreveport included, but every university has a pile of money that they tease professors with every year and says these are some competitive research monies that and we have to submit a proposal for a study, just like I'm asking you to craft. And then there's a team, a panel of professors that take a look at all the proposals that are put before them, and they'll say, okay, we'll throw $10,000 to Dr. M for her study, and we're going to throw $15,000 to Dr. W for his study, and we're going to throw $25,000 to Drs. PQR for their study, and but it's all on a competitive basis. So every university has money available to help professors conduct studies. There are also many huge foundations, and some of you, if you look in our collective learning, and when you look under that in that column on the funding, you'll see the Broad Foundation, the Meadows Foundation, all kinds of foundations. Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates are huge funders of education studies. So those are their nonprofit, non-governmental organizations. The United States government also throws a ton of money through the Department of Education at research. So you have governmental money that's provided for research. You have commercial money, as I mentioned earlier, and so it's particular industries or companies, sometimes just a company. Usually it's done under the guise of organizations like the National Grocery Manufacturers Association, for instance. And then you have the government, and then you have the nonprofit organization things that throw a lot of money at research, and particularly those are quite often done through charitable organizations of one kind or another. And then you have the non-governmental organizations, and then you also have, and some of you have also come up with where professors or researchers have funded the study out of their own pocket, and you see that a lot. Okay, and by the way, professional organizations too. If you belong to the National Association of School Administrators or the National Association of School Counselors or public relations officers or school business officers, almost always those professional organizations have a pile of money that they throw at some research as well. Let's talk about the research questions a little bit. And I forced you through the discussion forum this week to begin thinking about that process, and I'll help you. Now this week, the content that I fed to you is designed to help you begin to refine your thinking with regard to the questions. Almost always, the questions start out far too broad for you to stand any chance at all of getting any sort of credible evidence. So as you think and you ponder your question, it will get narrower and narrower and narrower, so that you will end up with a question that you think, okay, you know, it's a nice tight question, and I actually think I can collect some data that will give me some information about that question. You can use more than one research question. Some of you have found studies that are driven by more than one question. If you get too many questions, research questions, then the whole thing gets mushy. If you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing very well. A couple of things that you might consider as you're refining your question, and this is one of the things I ask you in the Google form prompts. What questions did the researchers suggest for future study? Almost always, not always, but more often than not, researchers at the end of their study will say, we believe that some important questions related to this that would be useful for future study are, and they'll list a few questions. So if you find a study that's in an area of interest that really trips your trigger, you can take a look at those questions and see if there's some questions there that you think might fit an interest for you. Another place to help you look as you're doing research and deciding on questions is when you come across a study that really is you really like, either by very prominent authors, or you just have found a study that just nails an area of interest for you. Take a look in the references that they provide, the bibliography that they provide at the end of the study, and see who they read. I call that daisy chain research. I used to do it all the time when I was working on my master's and doctorate, but I was still having to go into the library to dig out articles and stuff. So if I could find a study that was really, really good and right down the line of what I was interested in, then I would flip to the back of that thing and I would start looking for articles and books that the authors of that study were citing as important implications for their thinking and conclusions. Let's see, theory. At the end of the day, theory is just a concept we use to explain or describe or predict. I ask you in your Google form to identify the theoretical framework if there was one. And that's almost every term I teach this course. This causes a little heartburn for some of you students. And here's the deal. If the authors of the study are using a theoretical framework, they'll tell you. They're going to say we're leveraging the theoretical framework of phenomenology, or we base this study on the theoretical framework of critical theory, or we are standing on the theory of feminism. Or if more specific to education, Dr. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So they may say we stand on was standing on the work of Dr. Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligences. So when they divulged that theoretical framework, what they're doing is they're trying to bolster their own credibility by saying, not only are we engaged in this study on our own, but we are also leveraging and relying on this huge body of literature that's widely accepted within our profession. Now, that's not to mean that everyone believes in feminism, and it's not to say that everyone believes in critical theory, and it's not to say that everyone believes in Dr. Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. What it is saying is there's a huge number of researchers, scientists, and professionals that accept these theories as credible, valid, and reliable. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to build credibility for themselves and the study that they're fixing to reveal to you. So if the authors used a theoretical framework, they're usually going to state it, and you can almost always find it in the abstract right at the beginning of the article. But sometimes you'll have to go, almost always they'll reveal it within the first 5 paragraphs of the article, because they're trying to build credit. They're trying to hook you with the work of others. Let's see, scientific method. The whole purpose in the scientific method is rarely, and I don't care what field we're talking about. I don't care if we're talking about physics or law or agriculture or education. It doesn't matter. There are very few epiphanies that occur through research. Rarely is there an epiphany. Almost always, research is just pecking around the edge of previous research. We're just trying to expand the knowledge base little by little by little. So be particularly leery, skeptical, but not cynical, of any author that makes some sort of huge declaration, about a discovery that they have made through their research that would be earth-shattering. Just hardly ever happens. Very rarely ever happens. I hope that you have now looked, if you look in the week 2 module in Moodle, in the learning enhancement section, you'll now see that the collective learning for week one is live. And if you look in there, I show a line for learning task 1, learning task 2, learning 3, 4, and 5. And as I get those things graded and cleaned up, then I give you a link where it says here. And so in learning task 1 right now, you can look in learning task 1.1 in that collective learning, and you can see the response of every one of your classmates. Well, every one of your classmates that have submitted something so far. And that stuff gets, I constantly look back there, and when someone has added something late, or as some of you know, I've also given you, several of you, opportunity to redo. So if you do the redo, typically what I do is I clean it up by taking your new submission and I delete the old submission out of there. I hope when you look at the collective learning here, this is one of the things I think you'll see as you take a look at the comments of your classmates. It's amazing the diversity of the learners that we have here in our particular learning community. I mean, we got some young pups, in the earlier or mid-20s, with very little experience in the classroom. And then we got some all the way up. As far as I know, I'm the oldest fart in the group. And I'm almost 62 now and got about 40 years of service, but there's a few others that got a little age on you too. Most of you are in the mid-range of your careers, but it's amazing when you take a look at the comments and the findings of your classmates of what resonated with one, another one doesn't even speak to. Or what one of you says, the newest, freshest learning for me was this. But then you look at the next one, and the one that says, the thing that was least beneficial to me in the whole article was the same thing that the other one thought it was the newest, freshest learning. The same thing occurs in your third grade classroom and your seventh grade classroom and your junior classroom. I'm not sure seniors in high school learn anything, so I'm not sure we can speak to that. But the diversity of learner, every one of us is at a different place in our learning journey. Every one of us. And so that's one of the reasons that I frame the questions in the response tool that I've crafted for you, because I want to give you the opportunity to tell me what you're learning, and to think about what you're learning, and discern, prioritize what you're learning. These were the things I took out of it, and this was really the most important part for me, and this was the least important part for me, because it's going to be different for all of you. Really, a couple of words that you're going to come across as we talk through the research, graduate research stuff. One of them is epistemology, which is particularly relevant to those of us in the profession of education. And really, epistemology is the easiest way for me to think about it without trying to go into a dictionary definition. Epistemology is ways of knowing, ways of knowing. And then another word you're going to come across, particularly as we talk about qualitative research, is ontology. 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 And I always think of ontology in terms of ways of being. Particularly, those of you, several of you noted that the concept of ethnography was a new learning for you. And really, ethnographies are all about ontology, ways of being, and people's perceptions of where they fit into the social context, or as one of my favorite American philosophers, Ken Wilber, calls it, the cosmos. Anyway, qualitative and qualitative comparisons those are going to keep coming at you. Don't have a cat over it. And the types of studies, you're beginning to get a taste of those. They run all the way from what we call meta-analyses, in which the authors of these studies, rather than create a new experiment of some kind or another, they've decided, we're going to take a look at all the research that's been done in the last 30 years on this topic and see if we can tease something out of it. And a particular author in our professional genre is Dr. John Hattie out of Australia, and who's done a huge meta-analysis of I call them the teacher moves, the teacher moves that either aid or inhibit learning in the classroom. And he's ranked them even. But Dr. Hattie took thousands of studies on instructional practices, and it created a methodology that he used to quantify those. And so he ranked them. It's really great stuff. And you see some of the very best thinkers in the field of education quote Dr. Hattie a lot. So you got the meta-analysis, where you're just studying huge piles of previous studies, and then all the way on the other end of the continuum, you have the case study, where a little old researcher like Nelson Coulter has decided to go study the third grade teacher at the end of the hall that's been doing it 30 years and just a remarkable teacher, and you just sit down and you do the case study of one person. And that would be a qualitative study. But you're trying to figure out what you can learn from and about that person that will inform the rest of us. So there's the spectrum, the continuum, if you will. Comes in all shapes and sizes. Your research questions, let's talk about those for just a minute, because I've already asked you to start thinking about those. As you refine and mush and morph those things, and some of you are just going to get pissed off and say, I'm going to start over and do another one. Okay, that's typical. But you're looking for a question that's pretty specific. You're looking for one that you can actually measure something about it. You also have to think about from the behind the eyes of the researcher, is it something I can do? I mean, can I actually pull it off? And then, as some of you have noted, this seemed to be new learning, is on the ethics issues. If you're doing research on humans, which almost all educational research is, then you have some hoops to jump through to get access to those humans, and then also to get permission to do the research with those humans, particularly if you're doing research with children. But so you're looking for specific and measurable and doable and access. And you don't ever want to use as a research, you don't ever want to use a research question that can be answered with a simple yes or no. It's got to be something that you can dig around on, and then you can try to tease information out of. Okay, I'm just jabber. I need to move quickly so y'all can answer me questions. On the qualitative thing, as I said earlier, some of it, that's new for some of you, and it's kind of old for some of you. But the way I think, and I was a former math teacher. I charaded as a math teacher for 14 years in the public schools, and then they found me out. But really, quantitative is about the numbers. Qualitative is about the stories behind the numbers. And so some folks are very much into the quantitative stuff, which is fine. I should have loved quantitative because I was a math guy. You know, I understand the numbers. I like the numbers. But when I did my study for my doctorate, I chose mixed methods. So instead of just taking the numbers or just trying to figure out what the story was, I took the numbers and then tried to figure out what the stories behind those numbers were, I'm using both arms of the research tools, and we call that mixed methods. Let's talk about the research mining, learning tasks 4 and 5 for just a moment. Most of you all seem to be catching on to this a little quicker than my previous classes. It'll get easier and easier and easier. Here's a hint. As we move along, and you look in the collective learning for week 1 and learning task 4 and learning task 5, you can see where some of your colleagues were able to find some interesting articles of research. So use your colleagues, use the people in this class to help you in that process as well. You should, I said this last week, but I'll say it again. My goal was for you to not have to pay one single penny for any content in this course. And so it would pain me to think that any of you had to lay down money for an article. I think you can find all the research you want without having to pay any money. And especially through using the LSUS Noel library databases, I can't imagine that you couldn't find research that you wanted. That reminds me, some of you, well, on the articles that you're finding, that the legitimate studies, and I told you this last week, but it bears repeating. Don't tell me that a blog page is a study. No, and rarely are books. Rarely do books qualify as studies. I mean, a study is very specific, you almost always will find them in peer-reviewed journals, which is journals that you don't just write the article and send it in and they print it. You write an article, you do a study, you write an article and you send it, and then a panel of your peers reads through it and slices it and dices it and criticizes it and make you feel foolish. And then finally you massage it a few times and they say, okay, well, we'll call that scholarly now. And then they'll print it. But peer-reviewed journals use that sort of format. We also call those refereed journals, where they have a panel of scientists and professionals that will read every article that's submitted, and then that panel decides whether it's valid, credible, doable, and has some real applicability to our field. And if so, then they'll print it. And then there's other kinds of research which are scholarly publications, but they may not be refereed, where you submit an article and they'll say, yes, this is pretty nice, you know, and they'll just print it. And the standard of discernibility, I guess is the word I'm looking for, is not quite as high on those, but still those are often good articles. There's also a thing that happens in the field a lot with you and I. It's called action research, and it's where a teacher or a principal or assistant principal on a campus decides to study some element. When I was a campus principal on a large high school campus, one of the things that we did once, I even asked each department chair and the faculty in their departments to pick something that they wanted to study as a team, an action research project. And that was really a good exercise for all of us. I worked in one district, actually, earlier in my career. I was a campus principal, and this was a pretty large district. They didn't even use the same kind of evaluation system for teachers and principals that we are accustomed to, where you get this scorecard, you know, and a rubric of proficiency, and the principal comes in your classroom one time a year and then gives you a score, and then you sit down and have an awkward conversation at the end of the year and all that stuff. That district I worked in based our entire evaluation system for teachers and principals, and also the central office people, around action research. Each of us had to engage in an action research project every year, and we had to present that to a team of our peers, and usually in April of the spring. One of the most meaningful and richest professional development environments I've ever worked in. It's great stuff. Sample size matters. And now I mentioned a while ago in a case study, quite often you're just studying a sample size of one. Who was it? Somebody on Learning Task 5 came up across a sample size that went over 1 million. I forgot which one of you it was, but boy, that's huge. But my point is this: typically, if you're trying to tease out trends, the larger the sample size, the better. I mean, you're probably going to find more reliable, credible trends if you're studying 600 fourth grade teachers than if you decide to study one down the end of the hall. So what you're looking for is evidence that would be applicable to our field as a whole. And so the sample size, the larger the sample size, is a general rule, the larger the sample size, the more credibility we put into the studies. I'm almost done, I promise, and I'll answer your questions. The topic of limitations, sometimes you see it written as delimitations. Almost in all studies, the authors will, and I ask you about this in the Google form when you got to give responses. Almost always the authors will cite their limitations. And what the limitations are is the authors of the study try to steal your thunder. They know you're going to read their work with a very critical eye and a skeptical eye. So when an author states the limitations of the study, what they're basically trying to do is beat you to the critical punch. They're going to say, these are the things that we found in this study, but we know we only had a sample size of 12. And so that automatically raises some question marks over how valid our conclusions are. Or the authors may say, a limitation of our study was we did this and we got, let's say we got 250 principals that responded to our survey. These are the conclusions, but we understand that every one of those principals happen to live in the state of Idaho. So that could skew the data and the conclusions and may inhibit the applicability across all states. So it's the authors basically saying, yeah, we know where the problems are, and them stating them very overtly. Every week, I think every week, when I'm reading through your responses and when I'm thinking through our content and when I'm, books that I've read come to mind. And so I'll frequently, those of you that have me in other classes will have listened to this blather before, but I often think of books that are relevant to what we're talking about. And so here's a couple, 2 or 3 books this week. that are very relevant to this concept the concept we're talking about last week and this week, which is the overview of research and also forming questions. One of the most powerful compendiums of research that I've read in recent years was written in 2015 by Dr. Michael Greger. And interestingly, the book was titled How Not to Die. And I read it because I was interested. My wife and I have been very interested now that we're kind of getting old. I don't know if we're elderly yet, but we're getting old. But we've become very interested in trying to maintain optimum health right up to the bitter end. You know, I want to be running and playing and watching my grandkids run cross country and then just fall over dead. You know, I don't want to go through the long sickness stuff. And so what Dr. Greger and Dr. Stone did in that book is they took at the top 15 killers of humans in the United States and began looking at the data of what generates those maladies, those health maladies, and then they began looking for evidence of how we can interdict that. And so it was a very good, very empirically based work. And Dr. Greger is a huge skeptic, and so it makes his work even better. Dr. Dan Willingham, out of the University of Virginia, he's in our genre. He's in the education. He's actually a cognitive scientist. That's what he describes himself as, a cognitive scientist. And he wrote a book in 2009 that I have actually used in faculty studies, team studies, called Why Don't Students Like School? A cognitive scientist answers questions about how the mind works and what it means for your classroom. Very good book and very grounded on the research that Dr. Willingham and his colleagues have done. And then finally, the late Dr. Stephen Hawking from Great Britain. We all know him as the Uber physicist, and he passed away a couple of years ago, I guess. He wrote a book in 2002 called On the Shoulders of Giants, and it had a great impression on me when I read through that book. And it's not a book about physics. His book is talking about how all of the work of people like you and I now are built on the work of some very seminal, iconic, prolific thinkers hundreds of years ago. And he talks about how so much of what we know is so dependent on what the groundwork that those people did. It's really a good work. It's not just for the science freaks among you. It's really a pretty good work. By the way, students ask me often about book recommendations. If you haven't been to my personal website yet, I invite you to go there. It's www.nelsonwcoulter.com. I have one tab there just with book recommendations along several different topical areas: leadership, teaching and learning, health and well-being. So if you're interested in reading something like you have time to read something if you're in graduate school, I know, but some of you may actually be doing some team studies with your PLCs. So there's some, I'll tell you this, I don't put the crappy books on that list. I read a lot of stuff because I don't sleep very well. So the only books that you'll find on my recommendation list are the really good ones. By the way, too, if my website, I blog regularly, you're welcome to look at that, but my life is an open book. You can find out just about whatever you want to about me from my website. I'm going to go to the Q&A on the chat board, or let me get my notes off the screen here so I can see you in case somebody wants to ask me a question. Let me look at the chat box first. Where they are? Katie, I hope it's okay if I call you Katie. Where in the article can we find who funded the study? Typically, Katie, you find that very early in the first few paragraphs. If they're trying to pay homage to the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation, if that's where they got their money, they'll say it early on. We were able to conduct this wonderful study thanks to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or at the very end. They almost never stack it in the middle of the article. You find it early or you find it late. Dawn says she hasn't found the funding. usually, almost always, the assumption you can make is if they don't cite the funders, then they probably funded it themselves. Almost always, if someone laid out some cash for you to do a study, you want to publicly thank them for that, and the way to do that is to state in the article, in the findings of the research, who funded the study. So you can almost always make the assumption that that if it's not stated, then it came out of the pockets of the people, the researchers. Credible, reliable. Question. I got a question, and I don't know if you all can see it or not. I got a question that wanted me to repeat something. I was talking about credible, reliable, and applicable for our field. Those are the three big things that you're really looking for in quality studies. Aaron asked if the theory is not directly stated in the research, do you want us to leave it blank? You can, yeah, Aaron, you can. If they don't state a theoretical framework, then you can just say could not find one or not stated. Yeah. And let's see, another question that I got on the side. I don't think you all can see this. Oh, please don't drop. Please don't drop. I made it through graduate school. If I made it through graduate school, anybody can. I know you're all busy. Any other questions before I sign off? I'm yabbering and jabbering tonight. I don't even know how many of you are with me tonight. My wife always asks me how many are there, and I don't know. I don't count them. There you are. Almost every one of you has better hair than I do. Okay, I said this last week, and I'll probably say it every week. It's just a great honor to have the opportunity to learn along with you and from you. I don't have that many years left, and particularly of usefulness, and so it's just a great honor to be able to engage with bright minds every week like yours. I will see you next week. I think all of you know this. If you reach out to me in the Moodle or email, or most of you have my cell phone number, I'll get back to you in a heartbeat. Have a good week. Forge ahead.